wanted to provide you all with some nice elevator music beyond the typical jazz. We thought some good Earth, Wind, and Fire would help us set a good mood for today.
That's a perfect way to start.
Great. So I am Lauren Parker, and I will be moderating this conversation with the lovely.
I'm Kiala Jacques, and I am excited to bring you this session called Social Justice, What's Your Function? This is the second of a week-long trajectory of social justice conversations centered around public health and issues in Baltimore during Baltimore Week. So the first week of October, every year, Source hosts Baltimore Week. And this year, we're excited to celebrate 15 years as a center. And in the work that we're doing this particular week, we are excited to bring you an incredible amount of conversations. So if we could advance to the next slide. We want to start with this acknowledgement that we are on the traditional lands of the Piscataway tribe, and we want to honor that they are the indigenous peoples and traditional landholders of the Chesapeake Bay region. We also want to acknowledge we can't have a conversation without social justice without acknowledging the impacts of racism, systemic oppression, including the practice of redlining, colonialism, genocide, state-sanctioned violence on the lives of Black and Brown folks in Baltimore. So we are taking this moment to acknowledge. I am going to ask that we advance to the next slide so I can lead us in a little bit of a conversation about the other items that we have for you during Baltimore Week. One more click will show the lineup. So today is Social Justice, What's Your Function? Tomorrow we have an all-day event focused on environmental justice. So we would love for you to join us and bring your lunch to the lunchtime panel conversation on environmental justice with an amazing group of folks from inside and outside of the institution. We have some remarkable local community-based organizations represented. And then in the evening, we're going to take our conversation to the practice space, and we're going to engage in social justice sustainability circles. So we would love to have you join us that evening and really set a strategy around how you can be active in addressing environmental justice issues here in Baltimore. Also, on Friday, we have a really great conversation examining power, privilege, and public health as it concerns to conversations on safety. How do we codify those in policy, and who gets the privilege of feeling safe? We would love for you to join that conversation. And I would be remiss if I did not, if we advance to the next slide, encourage you to register to vote if you're not registered, and maybe you already are registered and you haven't yet created your plan around voting. So there are lots of folks that are interested in helping you exercise your civic right to vote and help you put a plan in place around that. This is a critical moment in time, and we want to make sure that your voice is heard. So engage with Hopkins Votes to get the support that you need to either get registered or create a plan around voting. So one more slide is the grounding slide. We're going to be talking about issues of race and racism. We're going to talk about federal policy. And you may find that there's a little bit of discomfort as you're navigating this conversation. We hope that you find it engaging, but if you find that there's some discomfort coming to bear in your body, it's completely fine. Discomfort is the way that our bodies let us know that we are up against our learning edge, up against challenges, and it's an opportunity to grow. So if you find yourself a little uncomfortable and you're not sure what to do with that, I encourage you to engage in a deep breath. You can start in your mouth and out of your nose, or maybe you want to keep it to yourself. You don't want anybody to know that you are engaging in your deep breaths. You can just engage with breaths in and out of the nose slowly. That'll help you really gain control of your amygdala, which when it's hijacked, it's really hard for us to think logically and remain engaged. So this is the grounding for that, to give you the tools that you need to engage with the discomfort and remain present in your body. So now I think without further ado, we're excited to bring to you this conversation, Social Justice, What's Your Function? We're also inviting folks to be active in the conversation on Twitter. So this is our first Baltimore Week tweet chat. Yay! You can join the conversation by using the hashtag SJWYF Live. Social Justice, What's Your Function live. And we are going to have some questions that we'll throw out on Twitter. The content that we're sharing with you will also be shared on Twitter. You can literally join the conversation live and encourage others who may not be present with us to join the conversation as well. So I'll cover the learning objectives and then I'll turn the floor over to Lauren. But I just want to check in with folks. We would love to be able to share this at a later date. So if you consent to having us record this session, please just do me a favor and type yes in the chat. I'm going to take a second and wait to see if we have consent. If we do, we'll move forward. If we don't, we'll redirect ourselves. All right, I'm seeing yes light up the chat, which makes me very happy. So thank you so much for your willingness to allow us to share this content at a later date. We're going to move forward now with our learning objectives, which are to identify key social justice frameworks and terminology, as well as to apply the key frameworks and terminology to a discussion and a case study. So before we get started on unpacking things, we want to ask, what do you know? And I'm going to drop a link in the chat and allow you to engage in a quick survey. It'll take you 3 to 5 minutes max. If you will click the link and engage in a survey, we will play a little music while you complete that. And in 3 minutes, we'll bring you back so we can start our conversation. It looks like we're having a little trouble with the link. Let me update that. All right, folks, give it a try now.
It's still expired. Well, for the purpose of time, and we want to be respectful to everyone's time, maybe we'll just go ahead and start our conversation today. So once again, thank you all for coming and participating in this initial conversation. This is more of a we were providing you all with some terminology to use so we can have a further conversation later. So in addition to it being COVID in the middle of a pandemic, we know as a nation we've gone through a number of violent events that have taken place towards people of color. And in response to that, a number of national organizations, as it relates to public health and medicine, have been speaking out to address head-on racism as a public health problem. Our very own, a lot of people here are in the space of public health, and the American Public Health Association has called to address racism as a public health problem specifically. And so some people might say, this is great, and this is really great. And a lot of people are doing this in response to things that have happened, but one great thing, and it's kind of a cool thing to think about in terms of public health, is that they've kind of been on the front line of thinking about racism as a public health problem for a long time. So this isn't new to them. This has been a long trajectory in the American Public Health Association about calling racism head on as a public health issue, and also a fundamental factor related to some of the racial and ethnic disparities we see in health outcomes. So what is racism? A lot of times we talk about racism, and I've heard buzzwords about racism, or someone's a racist, or someone is being discriminatory, and sometimes those terms can be a little murky. So when we think about racism and how we're going to conceptualize it for this conversation is that racism is an ideology of inferiority that is used to justify unequal treatment of members of a group defined as inferior, both individual and also societal institutions. And so it's actually the treatment of someone is treating them as inferior is discrimination. So those terms can be a little bit murky. Another set of definitions is that this might lead to the development of negative attitudes and beliefs towards an outgroup, and that's prejudice. So a lot of times people might think, well, racism, well, how does that impact health and health outcomes? I myself have published on this work looking at racism and also discrimination and how that relates to the health and healthcare utilization among African-American males here. When we think about racism, it has two different impacts on health. Racism can be an indirect effect. So as we know here in the United States, certain racial and ethnic groups have had historical mistreatment from individuals, and also in terms of actualizing societal goods. So racism has restricted a lot of the socioeconomic attainment. So if you think about advancing here in the United States, a lot of that is tied to access to education. And as many of us on the call may be aware that there are certain groups, and I'll say specifically like African Americans, who were limited in their opportunities to have access to things like education or different types of jobs for things such as race. So when we think about racism in terms of an indirect effect, that can be related to educational or employment opportunities, or things like segregation. In addition to having indirect effect, there are direct effects that racism can have. There is a slide that I love to show when I'm teaching this in the classroom, but for today, I'll just give a brief demonstration using my hands. When we think about the direct effects, you think about racism as being a stressor. And so oftentimes our bodies are just kind of smooth sailing. And so when people experience some type of race-based event, this could be someone saying something to them, this could be going to apply for a position and being denied and knowing that that could be because of your race. And so most people are kind of like smooth sailing, but when that happens, those experiences can do something to your body. So it disrupts your body. So your body is like this, and this is something that disrupts your hypothalamic pituitary axis, or HPA axis. And so your body can be in a flux. And a constant flux can be detrimental to your health. This is a chronic stressor. And we know from the stress literature that chronic stressors can lead to things like hypertension, heart disease, a whole lot of other conditions. And so while some people, after they go like this and they experience something, they could come back down to a nice even keel, but constant exposure to this flux can have really poor health outcomes. And so when you think about it, if you have these experiences of indirect effects and then also the direct effects, and you think about how this is all because of something like racism, we can really see how these impacts really influence health outcomes. I'm going to show a brief video about a gardener's tale. This is a great illustration about the different levels of racism. Some of you all may be aware of it. It's a quick film. Can you all see the film, or can you still see the PowerPoint? Okay. all see the film? You can't, okay. Thanks for being patient as we all work together to work on technology things.
This story is about a gardener who has 2 flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms and some is going to produce red blossoms. And the gardener pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed and she puts it in the rich, fertile soil. And she takes the pink seed and she puts it in the poor, rocky soil. And 3 weeks later, she comes and she's looking at her flower boxes, and what she notices is that every single one of the red seeds has sprouted. And some of the seed is tall, some of the red flowers are tall and strong and flourishing. The weak seed in the red at least has sprouted and made it to a middling height. But when she looks in the pink box, in that poor rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died. And the strong pink seed is just struggling to make it to a middling height. And then those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year, the same thing happens until finally, 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. Now we'll interrupt that to say that this first part of the story is how institutionalized racism works. You had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the 2 types of soil. You had the flower boxes, the contemporary structural factors, keeping the soil separate. And then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of that difference. But now we're going to pick the story back up and say, well, where would personally mediated racism be in this garden? Well, that's when the gardener's looking at her flowers and she says, those pink flowers are so scraggly and scrawny, and she plucks those blossoms off before they can even go to seed. Or she might notice that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil and she plucks it out before it can establish itself. And then where would internalized racism be in this garden? Well, you have the pink flowers in their box trying to make it, looking over at red, which is all flourishing and flaunted. And here come the bees. And the bees are minding their own business. They're just collecting nectar, but they're pollinating at the same time. So the bees are buzzing around. Here come the bees to the pink flowers. Bzz, bzz, and it comes over to this one pink flower. Bzz, and the pink flower says, get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red. Because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So then the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, you could say, well, let's address the internalized racism. So we're going to go over to the pink flowers and we're going to say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink, which might make the pink flowers feel better, but that in and of itself is not going to change the conditions in which they live. Or you could say, okay, well, I understand that. Let's address the personally mediated racism. So let's go talk to the gardener, or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener, which is all good. But we're going to say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink blossoms? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. What you really need to do if you want to set things right in this garden is to address the institutionalized racism. So you have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's okay too, although to me it makes it easier to segregate resources. But if you want to keep separate boxes, then you have to enrich that poor rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when you do that, you know the pink flowers will flourish. They will look grand and beautiful and wonderful, maybe even better than the red, because they have, after all, been selected for survival and strength, which is a very, very interesting notion. And then once those pink flowers are flourishing, they'll no longer be looking over at red, wanting to be red. So you'll have also addressed the internalized racism. And in addressing the institutionalized racism, you may even address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave, preferring red over pink. But her children, seeing the flowers equally beautiful, would be less likely to adopt that attitude. So this story has very quickly been to illustrate these 3 levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. and to very strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we have to at least address the institutionalized racism. We can address the other levels at the same time, but we have to at least address the institutionalized racism. And when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. There's just one last piece to the story, which is the important question: who is the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one that I've given the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources. And who is this gardener really? Well, certainly government is part of the gardener. You know, sometimes I joke and say, well, maybe the rich people behind government are part of the gardener. Maybe we can be our own gardener in communities if we have this power to decide, power to act, and control of resources, which is what I also describe as self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, whoever's going to have this power, it's very important that the gardener be concerned with equity. If the gardener is not concerned with equity, then you'll have the scrawny looking pink flowers and the pretty red flowers, and the gardener will be thinking that the garden is beautiful when in fact it is not.
Okay, sorry friends. There you go. Share. So I think that that is a great tale about the different levels. So just to reiterate some of the concepts and terms that she discussed was that internalized racism, excuse me, that's really the acceptance of members of acceptance by members of a stigmatized social group of negative messages about their abilities and intrinsic worth. And so this is a stereotype that I'm going to use to illustrate this example. So some people might have said the terms like, oh, blondes have a lot of fun. Blondes are the greatest, they have a lot of fun. And so people who are blonde here take on this stereotype onto their own, and they say to themselves, well, I'm blonde, so that means that I have to have a lot of fun. So, and I'm using this as an example, and there's other terms that people have used to describe other groups. So this is an example that we can all understand. But if this is a negative stereotype, this would be something that they would take on, and this would be an example of internalized racism. So forms of interpersonal racism, or she calls personal mediated or interpersonal, those are differential actions towards other groups about their abilities, motives, and their intentions. So some people oftentimes, when they talk about racial discrimination, interpersonal are often some of the terms in which they're using to describe the incidents that happen. And then the last form is which that was discussed is institutional racism. And that's differential access to goods, services, and opportunities by society. So those are things, for example, redlining and other practices that were used towards certain groups to limit their access to housing, employment, and other opportunities. And so now I'm going to turn this over to Kiala.
Thank you so much, Lauren. So we wanted to give you an opportunity to apply these terms and examine what the impact can be as we consider current events. So you may or may not know that there is an executive order that has put a moratorium on diversity training that focuses on race and racism inside of the federal government. So this moratorium on trainings has in effect, really created the type of challenge that was illustrated in the Gardener's Tale. It's reduced the ability to address systemic forms of discrimination and give folks the tools to show up as different gardeners, especially as we consider public goods and resources and identifying who can qualify and receive those public goods and resources. If we head to the next, there we go. So how do we take a a position of becoming more informed gardeners so that we can really mindfully tend to the garden that's in front of us. We have to engage with tools, and gardeners use tools that will allow them to modify the soil, to modify those things that are growing in the soil. So let's consider critical racism or critical race theory a tool that we can use to examine the garden and the various things that are contributing to the inequity within the garden. So critical race theory is called a theory, but not in the way that we're often used to hearing about them in perhaps epidemiology or behavioral sciences. It's called a theory because it's a method that has been used in legal studies. And this method allows us to investigate the different approaches to the law as it pertains to equity and how the law is or is not carried out in equal measure for all parties. So when we think about research, scholarship, and practice, transforming the hierarchies within those, not necessarily the law, though the law might be part of it, but the policies, practices, and procedures around health requires that we engage with the understanding of the hierarchies so that we can examine how they do and don't serve health equity. So critical race theory then gives us this methodology for that examination. And in particular, it gives scholars the ability to not only identify and name, but to intentionally take steps to really transform those various systems. And because it's interdisciplinary, the tools within this particular toolbox, they range and they vary. So anti-racism is a hot button word right now, and you'll find that there are tenets of anti-racism in critical race theory. And ultimately, it gives you the opportunity to examine how knowledge is created. So we know that the policies, practices, and procedures that are in place are generated on ideologies, and those ideologies perpetuate various types of ways that the gardeners show up. So how can we then examine the knowledge that the gardener has around the ways that they show up in the garden? So critical race theory gives us tools to examine language. Freire talks about examining the world and the word. And so critical race theory gives us tools to examine the words that are used to move ideologies, beliefs, and practices forward, as well as look at the world in its totality. How is it precipitating racism? How is racism used as a tool that evolves? Because racism hinges on relationships, right? And if we are in relationships with each other and those relationships change and the power is held by those with dominant identities, but the relationship and dynamics change, and that means that racism is evolving and changing as our relationships change. So critical race theory gives us tools to examine the language, to examine the relationship and the actions that are associated within those relationships. So we have scholars of color to thank for moving this into legal scholarship, and various scholars to thank for moving it into educational space, because ultimately they have given us language resources and frameworks to examine what language we're using, how we're generating ideologies with those languages, and how our policies, practices, and procedures then are the methods by which we are furthering anti-racism, right? So if we go to the next slide, we'll examine some other key language that will be helpful for the conversation to move forward. So public health as a field is both the art and the science of protecting and improving the health of communities. That practice requires that we have some deep considerations, frameworks, methodologies, and tools, right? So critical race theory, one of the tools that it gives us is centering at the margins, to taking an account of those who are pushed towards the margins. If we think about power on a spectrum, those, because of their identities, are pushed towards the margins. And in the marginalization that they experience through our social agreements, they don't often have their voices centered. So centering at the margins really means bringing the voices of those who are most marginalized to the center of the conversation, working from those spaces, centering those stories, celebrating those lived experiences. Race consciousness then is the explicit acknowledgement of the workings of race and racism. So we have to, in critical race theory, both acknowledge and take steps to counter the role of race and racism, and counter storytelling becomes one of those processes by doing that. Again, if we're thinking about marginalized populations and their voices not being heard, we're often hearing from the dominant identity holders what is right, what is true, what is valuable, and bringing in the voices of those most marginalized and telling their stories now centers them as experts in their lived experience with contributions to that will enrich all of us. So if we think about taking that soil and mixing it up so that we all have enriched soil, that is an element of counter storytelling. So when we think about critical race theory and public health, now we have the opportunity to focus this understanding or this method on how it operates, how racism operates in society and how it impacts health. So often you hear this term disparities. The disparity research takes steps to examine how racism and up until very recently, it was only examining elements of race and ethnicity, but now we're starting to name racism, how that impacts the burden of disease on folks' health. So public health now has its own orientation towards critical race theory, right? Public health critical race praxis is the application of critical race theory in public health and using the methods to not only study race and ethnic disparities and differences in health outcomes, but also the systems that perpetuate them, generate them, and keep them moving forward. So that additional examination of race then becomes a way to generate knowledge within the field that is not centric, that is not dominant, and creating new conversations and new approaches to then redress, as it were, the inequities by again, examining the systems, naming these things, and then creating interventions that will disrupt how they function in society. So here's the part where we get to the conversation. I've mentioned this moratorium on diversity training. We've talked about race and racism and the role of critical race theory in public health to help us do intentional examination beyond, with the inclusion of naming race and ethnicity, but looking at the system and the systemic inner workings of racism. So we want to involve you in bringing these two things to bear on each other. If we go to the next slide, we have questions about what happens if we take away critical conversations around race and racism. So what could be the implications for public health research and practice, especially when we have the highest office in the land making decisions about how their staff, faculty, and essentially public servants will or will not have conversations that may impact the distribution of goods and services? What are the impacts of not using the tenets of critical race theory to inform public health policy? And then the last question is, how does social justice fit into the conversation? So we're going to break these into pieces, and this is the part where you get to be extremely involved in the conversation, whether it's virtually on Twitter or right now in this moment. I'm going to give you a few minutes to examine this first question. If we take away critical conversations about race and racism, what are the implications for public health research and practice? And then we are going to put you into small groups really quickly to talk about that one. And we'll come back and talk about these last two. So I don't know if I have the ability to send people to groups. I don't think I have. I think I made Azad the host.
I can co-host if you would like, if that makes it easier for you.
That might allow me the option to then generate groups for us. I'm so sorry that I didn't
no worries,
co-host
no worries
myself.
It's all right.
There we are. All right. So we're sending you to breakout rooms. I'm going to drop this question in the chat so that you can take it with you as you go. And then you can discuss in your rooms, and we'll come back together in just a moment to talk about your aha moments. So there's the question. You may copy it or screenshot it as I send you into breakout rooms.
Hey.
Hi. I wasn't sure if anybody else was here. So yeah, a lot to think about with those questions, right?
Yeah.
Hold on, let me bring up this chat again. Yeah, I mean, I think a key element of it is just questioning sort of like how knowledge is developed and who is determining the questions and how those questions are framed. And that really benefits from having sort of critical reflection. So if you take that away, I think that the questions that you ask and the knowledge that you then create from those questions is going to be less relevant and sort of further supporting the systems that you're working against.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, you know, tying it back to kind of like the moratorium on government training in this space, I think that, you know, if we're talking about like the National Institute for Health, CDC, you know, all kinds of government agencies, which really would, I think, tremendously benefit from this type of conversation and those kinds of questions being asked and that type of training, then I think, you know, you run the risk of really perpetuating the same kind of insensitivities or just in general, just the disparities and inequities that continue. So I think there's a major challenge, obviously, when you have like a president who is so in contempt of, you know, this type of work, and it does pose a huge challenge for, you know, public health agencies within the government itself to be able to adequately prepare, you know, their staff and all their professionals for really dealing with this in the right way and moving forward and improving care. So the implications are really, you know, far ranging, I think.
Sorry, I was in a breakout group by myself. So Carla, I didn't hear your first comments that as I was responding to. I'm trying to jump into your convo.
Yeah, I guess I just started by talking about the importance of the reflection of who's defining questions, and therefore the knowledge that's gained from those questions. And if you don't have the critical reflection on that and aren't, you know, specifically thinking about who's in the room and their experiences of who is there for framing that question, you are going to unintentionally perpetuate a lot of the things that you're trying to work against, basically.
Got it. So all of our systemic issues that continue to be issues when we don't have right folks at the table or having power or all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, and I think I like to think just even generally beyond sort of racial disparity work, but thinking about who owns the problem and like why do they own it and what are the repercussions of them owning it? Sort of thinking about how just in general people in power can take advantage of people not in power. So I think, you know, if the issue is still owned by white upper class individuals, even if they're really concerned with these issues and are working to fix those issues, there's still some unconscious things going on where it is serving them to own the problem in some way or another.
Right. Right. And like you said, outside of racial issues as well, it's everything. And that owning the problem, like we always say, like nothing about us without us. So if it's an issue that pertains to a particular population, and that population isn't a part of the solutions, then you're already messing up. You're already doing a disservice. You're not doing best practice, public health practice, research, education.
Yeah.
All around.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that, you know, you can see that particularly with the federal government now kind of going and putting this moratorium on, you know, teaching critical race theory and any kind of actual training in a meaningful way. Because of course, where was the input on that from, where did that come from? Where was that? Who had the president's ear there? And that access to powerful and influential people is just another layer of that, right?
Yeah, I was actually surprised that with that, I haven't seen anything from Hopkins
Right.
making a statement about it.
I
And
know.
here we are at a time where at the university level, there's the roadmap on diversity, equity, inclusion. At the School of Nursing, there's School of Nursing, Teaching and Learning for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. For the School of Public Health, there's the IDARE movement. All of these are things that the schools and the university are saying are important, and no one said a word about what that means.
Right.
Are we not allowed to say anti-racism because the administration of the government says that?
Right. Is it?
And we get government funding, so it's still like.
Yeah. It looks like we're closing here in the great. Okay.
Seeing smiles, that always indicates to me that the conversation was good. So I think we are all together. Perfect. And now, I wasn't in any rooms, so I have to hear all the good things that you talked about. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, and I would love to hear, we had 3 groups, so hear from one person in each group, your aha moments around this question.
Anyone want to jump in? I can jump in. We discussed a few different things, but mainly, raising the questions, who is, really making these decisions in terms of, working towards those disparities, who is working towards, actively against, solving those disparities and inequities. Where is the community input? I believe Mindy raised a great point. Nothing about us without us. So the challenge is that something like this, like a moratorium on training government agencies in racial sensitivity or foundational knowledge about intercultural communication, putting a moratorium on that and trying to understand the complexities of racism within the government itself really presents huge challenges, obviously, to public health agencies. I brought up like NIH, CDC, folks who are going to be providing care and doing research in this in the medical field and doing all kinds of things that will have long ranging impacts on people. And to kind of take that component of anti-racism work out, you are really obviously I guess, not equipping the staff or the government or the communities with the correct resources to really be advancing and ending those disparities. So obviously runs contrary to a public health mission in that sense. But we discussed some other things, and I'll let Mindy or Carla jump in.
Sure, just super briefly. We just talked about some ideas already brought up in terms of the importance of who's framing the question and therefore what knowledge is gained from that question. And that if that is concentrated among just people with power, they are inherently going to be sort of perpetuating some of the systems they're trying to work against. And the idea that when people own the problem, they get to define it, and that there are really can be really severe implications of that when there's not critical reflection on how that is being defined.
Thank you to the folks from that group for your thoughts and contributions. Other members of the other 2 groups? I guess we didn't establish ground rules so that we all feel safe to share. I should have started with that, but hopefully you recognize that this is a space where we're going to just practice some bravery. Your thoughts are welcome here.
I can go. Can you hear me? It's probably no, if you know me, you know that I probably went to the political route when we had this conversation, and we started talking about the federal government and something that you brought up earlier about the president and his, not funding organizations that wanted to talk about race in some of the trainings. And so we talked about that and how that if you don't have these conversations, it really continues to perpetuate those stereotypes, and individuals will not be able to move forward with thinking about the way that things are in the past, or looking at even how things are today with so much going on in the world with George Floyd and everything else, all the other issues that we continue to see, that we won't have those conversations and be able to move forward. We'll still be sort of stuck in a space where people won't feel comfortable and won't have an opportunity to really get past what's happening, whether it's in the workplace. And, we kind of talked about how, looking at the federal government and how things are so red and blue in terms of states, Democrats, Republicans, and how looking at the leadership of the federal government, does that trickle down to like these red states? Are the governors now saying, oh, if the federal government can stop having this conversation, we can stop our organizations from, funding organizations in state government that will want to have these conversations as well. And, that's just a scary thought. And so those are some of the comments or things that we talked about in our group.
Thanks for sharing, Tony. I think I was in Tony's group, and Sydney was in the group as well. And I was expressing, as a scientist, I've thought about this, because if we're saying that we're not using terms like critical race theory to inform our practice and potentially our resource, NIH, for example, is the #1 funder of me and my work. So I really thought about, well, then if I or anybody were to submit a proposal that said critical race theory in it, does that automatically mean that your work is not even going to be viewed? And then I think about the wonderful scholars who have done this work, and they've based a lot of their work on critical race theory. And so now to say that it's obsolete, so what happens at that point? So it's a lot to think about.
Thank you so much for sharing. We have one more group, and I'd love to hear from them.
We could share a bit about what we talked about. I invite Beckett as well to share. I think initially we were just sort of thinking about the inability to even do work or push ourselves and our knowledge further if we don't acknowledge the issue, which is essentially what the executive order is doing, taking even the question off the table. Which to me is, you can't even get a conversation started. Our breakouts are a perfect example, right? Without the question that you posed, there's no conversation in any of the 3 groups that we've just discussed. But then beyond that, we talked about even if we put the table back on the question, how do we ensure that it becomes part of what we are doing as scientists and researchers and public health professionals? Just because it's there doesn't mean we're doing it. Of course, it has been there even before this executive order came out. So what else needs to be in place to ensure that this work is prioritized and that folks are motivated to do it, have the space and energy and time to be able to ask the question appropriately, deeply. We mentioned the gardener metaphor is the sort of perfect example of that. What are the elements that provide the rich soil that we need?
Are there other comments? I have a really great segue, but I want to hold space for other people. Okay, well, know that you are invited to participate in this next question, and it really dovetails off of what Tyler posed and really what you are all saying, right? Like, to have the inability to pose questions and to think critically about what that means for resource allocation is definitely a space to focus some energy. But the other side of that is, without articulating that these things couldn't happen, there was space for them to happen, and I don't know that they were happening. that there were trainings that centered critical race theory, right? Or anti-sexism, that those were happening before the moratorium. So what are the ways then that we use social justice as our grounding principle to orient ourselves, regardless of what the powers may be, say that we can't do? What are the ways that we center on what we can do and use social justice to drive us? Or what are thoughts around that? And I'm going to put Lauren on the spot because she mentioned the research, Dr. Parker mentioned the research that she does. So maybe you can start the conversation by talking to us a little bit about the way that you center justice in the work that you do.
That's a great question. So while I love running numbers on the computer using secondary data, that's awesome. A lot of my work is about community-based research. So really being intentional about that work and being mindful to the community. I do a lot of work in Baltimore City, and we know that Baltimore City has a very interesting history as it comes to race-based things. And so I do a lot of work with older adults. And so we know that once you become an older adult, it's not that you just arrived at 65, 55, 70, but your lived experiences have shaped to some of the health outcomes that you have. So in a lot of my work, I'm very mindful about partnering with organizations, adult daycares, for example, and really getting them on board to help facilitate what I'm doing in my research. A perfect example of something that I had no insight on, but I was talking to community partners. So for my research, I collect salivary cortisol. So I collect biomarkers. And we know Hopkins has a very interesting history as it relates to biomarkers and people of color. And so I was going around and I had these flyers. I think I actually have one. And I was going around passing out these flyers, and I was like, I have a study. It's called the Peace Study. I'm collecting biomarkers. Help me, help me, help me. And so one of my community partners was like, Lauren, I'm going to have a conversation with you. And I'm like, okay, what's going on? And she's like, the flyers are not going to work. She's like, Hopkins has a very horrid history of doing research, especially amongst people of color, African Americans here. And then also what they do with the biomarker research. So she sat me down and had a conversation. So I had to revamp my whole recruitment strategy. And I'm appreciative of that she set me down and she felt comfortable, but that comes with building trust and relationships. So it wasn't just a one-day thing. This is a relationship that I have. I went to a winery with her. She's actually one of the coolest people I ever know now. I really enjoy her. But she really had a conversation with me about being mindful about how I'm recruiting and creating, for example, a video. So people want to see who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. So those are some of the ways that I've been mindful about developing a relationship and also keeping a justice framework in my mind. So if I would have approached this and not thought about Henrietta Lacks or other stories here in Baltimore that have impacted communities, I really could be missing out on recruiting African Americans for my study, and that's integral to the work that I do.
Thank you so much for sharing. So we saw elements of critical race theory, and of course we gave you an abbreviated version, right? But of the things that I shared, what did you hear as Lauren provided an example, Dr. Parker provided an example?
I was thinking of sort of the centering the margins, kind of that community engagement strategy of really like making sure that you have all the voices at the table and the voices that maybe are like not as represented in like historical research.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sydney. Other folks, what did you hear?
I would just add like the importance of acknowledging historical experiences and like just the lived experiences of others that you may not be aware of at the start.
Absolutely. Examining history, looking backwards to help us move forward intentionally. Yeah, thank you. Maybe one more person? I'll tell you what I heard, and maybe I'm a little biased because I work at Source, but I heard relationship. building relationship. And from that built relationship, there was enough trust to redirect the researcher. The community leader redirected the researcher, and the researcher was respondent. And that happened as a result of building an authentic and a genuine relationship that could guide the practice and the research, which I really appreciate you sharing. Even the winery, you'll have to let us know which one you went to. So as we think about other elements of critical race theory, I'm curious if there are questions that you have, or maybe knowledge that you want to bring to bear. One of the elements of critical race theory is recognizing that there is lived experiences in all of us. And so we are all both teachers and students. And I'm opening the floor now for folks to share what they know about this framework that might be helpful for the collective. And it's okay just to be learning and taking notes as well.
Yeah, I'll admit that I'm definitely here learning and taking notes. I've been working within the community sector for a while with undocumented population. So I think this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, but I have a lot to learn. And I think from Lauren's shared experience of just admitting sometimes that we don't have all the answers, and just knowing sometimes when to listen to your community, and that the best way to move forward is being humble.
Thank you for that, Becca. I celebrate the space that we could hold for collective learning. We're all here learning together and from each other. And you're right, there's something really beautiful about that level of humility. It is from that level of humility that true justice works happens, that we acknowledge that we are all works in process that have been, one, inculcated by the reality of systems of oppression, right? We've all learned them, they're second nature, we are fished in that water, and we don't even know what water is, right? And as we learn what water is, then we can identify, does this have the right pH balance or no, right? And we can make some intentional decisions on where are we swimming upstream or not. So thank you for being brave enough to share your growth process with all of us. Well, I'll invite Lauren to bring the slides back, in part because I want to share the resources that were connected to this presentation. Since we're all learning, it'll give you an opportunity to take a look at the resources. And because we are believers in reflection, I don't want to keep you from having your reflective moment. So maybe you take a second and think about what aha moment you had while we were in our conversation here. And after you've identified your aha moment, I'm going to ask you to make one commitment. What can you commit to in any shape, form, or fashion as a result of what we've talked about today? And you can drop that commitment in the chat when you're ready. So I dropped my commitment into the chat. You are welcome to drop yours into the chat as well. As you're typing them, I'm going to ask Lauren to advance the slide so I can tell you a little bit more about the rest of the week. If you did not sign up for other sessions, it's not too late. we invite you to join us for more conversations around social justice and issues in Baltimore for the rest of the week. We have 2 sessions Wednesday and a lunchtime session on Friday. So you can RSVP at source.jhu.edu/Baltimore Week. If you don't receive our scoop, we would love for you to stay up to date on all the things happening at Source. So you can do that as easily as emailing source@jhu.edu. And if you enjoyed this and want to be involved in other social media conversations or just take a look at what we're up to, you can definitely check us out on all social media platforms at JHU Source. And I will definitely say that we are open to having continued conversation. So if you want to have a meeting, if you want to keep the conversation going, feel free to email us at source@jhu.edu. I am a firm believer in giving people the gift of time. So we're scheduled to go until 1 o'clock, and I'm actually going to give you 10 minutes back, but we finally got the survey up and going. So I'm going to ask maybe you take 3 minutes of that 10 and complete the survey for us and let us know what you learned. And hopefully we will see you on Wednesday for the next round of conversations on environmental justice in our Baltimore Week series. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Parker.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.